What's up, sports fans? This is the Lucas Ross Sports Channel. We continue with our 2025 college football schedule previews and very early projected record series. The Georgia Bulldogs are up next. Before we go game by game and preview their schedule for 2025, let's take a look back at what Georgia did in 2024. Here were my projections and predictions last year for the Georgia Bulldogs. My projection for this team was 11-1, and then my prediction for them was actually 12-0. So I did predict Georgia to go undefeated last year just because of all the returning production they have coming back on the offensive side of the football, especially with Carson Beck back at quarterback. But obviously Georgia did a little bit worse than that. They went 10-2 as a team last year. Kind of the first 10-2 season I think they had under Kirby Smart in a very long time. But yeah, this team lost a couple of games in the regular season. Both of their losses came to Ole Miss and Alabama in the regular season. But when you look at Georgia, throughout the entire season, they look good at times and then they look down at times. But this team still made it to the SEC championship and, of course, won it against Texas. And they did not just beat Texas in the SEC championship. They also beat them twice, once in the regular season and then once in the conference championship. This team did make it to the playoff, but they were eliminated by Notre Dame in the second round of the quarterfinals. So overall, they finished 11-3 last year in 2024. This was the schedule from last season for Georgia, and again in 2024. It was a pretty tough schedule for Georgia. Had to play Clemson in the non-conference. They played that game, of course, in Atlanta. They kind of won that game easily, but they also played Tennessee Tech. They also played UMass and Georgia Tech. And, of course, Georgia Tech went into 8 overtimes last year, if I'm not mistaken. So, yeah, Georgia just had a pretty tough schedule, and especially in the SEC. In their home schedule, they played Auburn, Mississippi State, Tennessee. That was about it in the SEC. So they played 3 home games in the SEC. And then you got that one neutral site game against Florida in Jacksonville, and of course they won that game pretty close as well. But you look at their road schedule last year, they played Kentucky, Texas. Those were 2 other road games in the SEC, and then also Alabama and Ole Miss, which the 2 teams they lost to last year. So yeah, you could just see how tough this schedule was for Georgia. It was probably the toughest schedule that Georgia had in a pretty long time. Again, if you count Clemson in the non-conference, and then also Alabama, Ole Miss, and Tennessee, and then also Texas, these were really good teams in the SEC. Now, Ole Miss did not make the playoff, but Tennessee, Alabama did not make it in either. Texas made it to the playoff as well. So, yeah, pretty tough schedule last year for Georgia. Let's now look ahead to 2025. This is the schedule for Georgia coming up this season. Before we go game by game, let's take a look at who Georgia will play in the non-conference for this season. So it pretty much, an easier non-conference schedule compared to last year, in my opinion. They'll play Marshall, Austin Peay, Charlotte, and then on the road at Georgia Tech. So, again, they play Georgia Tech every year. That's a rivalry game, of course. They play them every single season. And then you get Marshall, Austin Peay, and Charlotte. 3 cupcake games. Marshall could be a little bit tough because Marshall was a little bit really good last year, but they lost their head coach, so I don't really think Marshall is going to be the same team as they were from last year. So, again, a very favorable non-conference schedule, in my opinion, for Georgia. No Power 4 team, to kick off the season. Again, you have to play Georgia Tech. That's a Power 4 team, and Georgia Tech played Georgia pretty close last year. We'll see how that plays out. Moving on to the home SEC schedule for Georgia, they'll play Alabama, Kentucky, Ole Miss, and Texas all at home this year. And in my opinion, I think this is a pretty favorable home schedule. You look at the 2 teams that you have on this home schedule, Alabama and Ole Miss. These are 2 teams that you lost to last year in the regular season. Those 2 games will be revenge games for Georgia, and Kentucky and Texas. They beat both of these teams last year. They beat Texas twice, not just once in the regular season, but also in the conference championship as well. So a pretty favorable home schedule for Georgia. Again, you get Alabama and Ole Miss, 2 teams that you lost to last year at home this season. You had them on the road last year. This time you get them at home. Moving on to the away schedule, they'll play on the road at Tennessee, at Auburn. They'll play, of course, Florida and Jacksonville. That's pretty much counted as an away game because it is in Jacksonville, Florida. It's not an away game at Florida. It's in Jacksonville. It's a neutral site, so that's why you see the start there on Florida. And then they're going to be playing on the road at Mississippi State. So this road schedule is, you got 2 tough road games with Tennessee and Auburn. Those will be very tough games on the road. Tennessee, always a really tough place to play in Knoxville. Auburn, obviously, a rivalry game. Anything can happen here. Auburn wasn't really good last year, so Georgia definitely probably will be the better team heading into this matchup. And then, obviously, you got Florida. That's another rivalry game. You know, last year's game was pretty close. It almost nearly went into overtime. But, yeah, Florida just came up short. But this year, Florida's got a lot of hype coming up in 2025. So let's go back to the schedule now and go game by game now for Georgia. And again, they'll kick things off with Marshall here on August 30th. Then it's Austin Peay on September 6th. Then they'll open up SEC play on the road at Tennessee on September 13th. Tough way to start out SEC play, in my opinion. This is kind of like an early SEC matchup because you do play Tennessee rather early this year instead of them in late November. They played, Tennessee in late November, probably like for the last couple of years. This year they will play them in the month of September, and they will play them on the road. They get a bye week, though, after that Tennessee game before playing Alabama at home on September 27th. I talked about this game being a revenge game here for Georgia. Last year they lost to Alabama. Last year in the first half it wasn't really close, but second half, Georgia kind of, came fighting back, but, Alabama still won at the end of the day. In the month of October, they'll play at home against Kentucky on October the 4th. Then they'll play on the road at Auburn on October the 11th. Come back at home against Ole Miss on October 18th, another one of those revenge games here for Georgia from last year. Then their second bye week becomes right before Florida, of course, on November 1st. It seems like they always get a bye week here before playing Florida. That's kind of the same case with some of these big rivalry games. For example, Ohio State and Penn State, it seems like they get a bye week before playing each other. Same thing with Alabama and LSU in the SEC as well. Then after that, it's on the road at Mississippi State on November 8th. Then back at home for Texas at home on November 15th. Then they'll play a cupcake game against Charlotte on November 22nd. And then they close things out on the road at Georgia Tech. I'm pretty sure that's going to be in the Mercedes-Benz Superdome in Atlanta. I think that's going to be probably where it's at, but it's a away game for Georgia nonetheless on November 29th. So that's the schedule for Georgia. Let's now go into a very early projected record here for the Bulldogs for 2025. This is the scale I have been using so far for these projections. And remember I said about the red games, those are counted as automatic losses. Those are games where Georgia has no chance of winning, but you're probably not going to see any games on here in the red, orange, or yellow because we know that Georgia will be favored in almost every single one of their games. But 20% games in the orange mean they'll be double-digit underdogs, 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that range. 40% games in the yellow are going to be games where Georgia will be a clear underdog in by about a touchdown, 6-7 points, somewhere in that range. 50-50 games, of course, are going to stay in the white, games that really can go either way. 60% games in the purple are games where Georgia will be favored by about a touchdown, 6-7 points, somewhere in that range. 80% games in the blue are going to be games where Georgia will be favored by double digits, 10 to 14 points. And then your 99% games in the green, just like the red games, they are counted as automatic wins, not guaranteed wins, but with this being a projection a little bit, that's going to be counted as an automatic win. So we'll start with the easy wins here for Georgia. In the green, I think you've got 4 easy wins on the schedule for the Bulldogs. You got Marshall, Austin Peay, and Charlotte, 3 out of your 4 non-conference games, and then you got Kentucky here in the SEC. Marshall, Austin Peay, and Charlotte, those games are definitely over that 95% to 99% mark, and then Kentucky definitely is at 90%. Now, to be fair, Kentucky gave Georgia some problems last year. Georgia only beat Kentucky by 1 point last year. That was about it, and it was in Lexington. If this game was at Lexington this year, it would definitely be in the blue just based off of that, but I'm going to put it here in the green. And Kentucky actually did not really perform that well for the rest of the season. Kentucky, even though they competed with Georgia, they did not end up being a really good team at the end of the year. So, and also playing in Athens, that's definitely a big advantage here for Georgia. So I'm going to say that Georgia will be about 3 touchdowns of favorites. Again, Kentucky will be definitely at 90%. I think that spread probably will be at 17 for that game. And then the Marshall, Austin Peay, and Charlotte games, those are definitely at 20-plus points. Let's now move on to the games where I think Georgia will be favored by 10 to 14 points, somewhere in that range in the blue. I got a couple of them, and they're both on the road at Auburn and at Mississippi State. I think Georgia will be favored in both of these games by double digits. Auburn was not really good last year, let's be honest. That's the reason why it's in the blue. And then same thing for Mississippi State. Georgia clearly is the better team compared to both of these teams. I think Georgia definitely should go out there and take care of business. But, Jordan-Hare Stadium, of course, a very tough place to play. I mean, Auburn hasn't really gotten off to a good start with Hugh Freeze as their head coach, but we'll see if they can turn things around in 2025. I get that it's a rivalry game. Anything can happen, but Georgia has just gotten the better of Auburn now for the last few years, so that's the reason why it's in the blue. Mississippi State, that's definitely a blue game for me. I don't know how good the Bulldogs are going to be of Mississippi State. So those two games, I think Georgia will be favored by 10 to 14 points. In the purple games, by 6 or 7 points, I got a couple of them, Florida and Georgia Tech. I get it. Florida, gave Georgia some problems last year, especially in the later part of the second half. But, Florida lost DJ Lagway in the first half. I feel like DJ Lagway would have played in the second half. Florida actually probably would have pulled off this upset last year, but I'm going to put it in the purple just for right now because Georgia still overall is the very talented team. But I wouldn't be surprised here if Florida actually shocked Georgia this year. Could this finally be their year? Could Florida probably win the SEC if they beat Georgia? I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell because there's so many great teams in the SEC. And if we had divisions still, Florida might win the SEC East. But with no divisions and the SEC going a different direction, this could be definitely a different game. But yeah, Florida in the purple just for right now. And then Georgia Tech, I get it. It's a rivalry game as well, but I think Georgia will be favored by 6 or 7 points. Georgia Tech was a pretty average team last year, but they gave Georgia all kinds of problems, especially going into 8 overtimes. And Georgia nearly lost last year. If Georgia would have lost to Georgia Tech, I think this would definitely be a 50-50 game for right now. But I'm going to stick with it and put both of these games in the purple. These are two rivalry games that really can go either way. But I think Georgia will still be favored by 6 or 7 points in both of those games. And then that leaves you with 4 50-50 games. Tennessee on the road, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas. You get 3 out of these 4 50-50 games at home this year, of course. Tennessee, again, will be a pretty tough place to play. I think Tennessee's going to be pretty good this year. Alabama, kind of hard to tell what they're going to look like, but Alabama beat Georgia last year. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. Same thing for Ole Miss. That's the reason why it's a 50-50 game. And then Texas, obviously, this is a pretty even matchup. I would probably favor Georgia in this game by 3 or 4 points or less. I mean, it's a pretty tight matchup. Let's be honest, both of these teams are pretty even in my opinion, and both of these teams met in the conference championship and regular season last year, and Georgia beat them twice. I know Georgia probably should be in the purple here at 6 or 7 points, but I think both of these teams are just pretty even in talent-wise, so that leaves you with 50-50 games. Let's now get a projected record here for Georgia. Again, I count the green games and blue games as wins, and then you average out the purple games at 60%. Then you split these 50-50 games. Let's say they win 2 out of the 4 50-50 games. That's going to give you a projection of 10-2 here for Georgia. So that is what the projected record looks like here for the Bulldogs. Again, if you split those 50-50 games, let's say they beat Tennessee and Alabama, and let's say they lose to Ole Miss and Texas, that'll still give you a projection of 10-2, but let's say they do the opposite. Let's say they lose to Ole Miss and Texas at home, or actually they lose, to Ole Miss and Texas at home, and then they, lose to Alabama and Tennessee on the road. That's still going to give you a projection of 10-2. Again, if you split those 50-50 games, you win 2 out of the 4. That's going to give you a projection of 10-2. So that is what the projected record looks like here for the Georgia Bulldogs in 2025. Do you guys agree or disagree? Let me know down in the comments below, and also give me your thoughts about Georgia's schedule down in the comments below. Is it tough or not so tough? Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more sports content videos on my Lucas Ross Sports YouTube channel.